By the end, the special military operation has turned into a blitzkrieg. When the Russians intensified their attacks around the city of Pokrovsk in a new push at the start of April 2025, it seems at first like another act of desperation. Thousands of Russian boys, dead men walking, pouring into the no man's land on motorcycle, on foot, even on crutches. But this time, the flow of young Russian souls didn't run out. Russia's missiles were getting better, the North Koreans were on the scene, the drone swarms couldn't keep up, the Americans didn't send help, and finally, out there in the blood-soaked Donetsk fields, the front line shattered into a million pieces. Within the day, the whole Donbass was under Russian control. Within a week, Russian armor was at the gates of Kyiv. By the end of the month, they'd rolled across the whole country, and the only thing that could stop them was the Polish border. By May 1st, 2025, the place that had once been Ukraine had been absorbed into the Russian Federation, and the old world order had been destroyed. Now, of course, there's an alternate telling of history, and it's a timeline that Ukraine in this world is lucky enough to have avoided. But it's also the dark possibility that Ukraine has been working so hard to avoid, shedding land, blood, and hundreds of thousands of lives to ensure its survival. So, in today's episode, we're going to explore the alternate timeline that we just laid out, and we're going to ask the question, what if Ukraine did fall to Vladimir Putin's Russia and fell under extended or quite possibly permanent occupation? How would Russian conquest play out across the nation? What would happen to Ukrainians who were forced to flee? And what would life be like for those with no choice but to stay? What would happen in Europe and across the rest of the world if Russia won and Ukraine became a land under occupation? Okay, now before we get into the weeds of this dark alternate history, we've got to set our terms of engagement. For the purposes of today's episode, we're not going to be focusing on what might have happened for Ukraine, Russia, and the world if Russia's special military operation had been over in a span of mere days back in 2022. Certainly, that's a topic we could also tackle on this channel, so let us know in the comment section if you want that. For today, however, we're going to proceed with the scenario that we laid out above. The war in Ukraine proceeds basically as we know it until the start of Russia's springtime and summer offensive this year, when a surprise mistake by Ukraine here or a surprise success by Russia there sets off a sudden cascade. The strategic hub of Pokrovsk falls to the Russians, then the front lines elsewhere begin to collapse, and before long, Ukraine is entirely under Russian control. As for why we're focusing on that scenario today, it's because these are the stakes in any and all discussion of a peace. If the war doesn't end, and if, in a worst-case scenario, Ukraine were to fall, then the world simply wouldn't revert back to the conditions of early 2022. Ukraine has changed, Russia has changed, Europe has changed, the entire world has changed, after 3.5 years of war. For Ukraine to come under occupation after all that bloodshed is a very different proposition than if Kyiv had gone down without a fight. So, let's start off by talking about Kyiv's fight, or in this case, Kyiv's final stand, because a Russian breakthrough at Pokrovsk by itself wouldn't be nearly enough to win the war. Instead, a victory in Pokrovsk would need to start a cascade of violent chain reaction where one Russian victory leads to the next and to the next. And by the way, for all of the close observers of this Ukraine war who are watching this episode, hello there, we do understand what we're describing would require manpower and strategic coordination that Russia hasn't actually been able to muster. Luckily, this is all strictly hypothetical. But in the event that a breakthrough at Pokrovsk did happen, Russia would have to move quickly in order to capitalize on those gains and start a larger chain reaction. Pokrovsk is a very important transportation hub, allowing supplies and military equipment to travel all up and down Ukraine's front lines and sustain the war effort elsewhere. If Pokrovsk were to fall, its absence would immediately place a severe strain on other parts of the front line for whom ammunition, fresh drones, food, medicine, and other critical equipment would become very difficult to obtain. Back in 2024, one Ukrainian expert told the BBC that if Pokrovsk were captured, it could lead to a collapse across the front line in the Donbass region. In practice, that means that Russia would conquer the areas of Kharkiv Yar, Kostiantynivka, and other important defensive zones before barreling towards cities like Sloviansk, pre-war population 105,000, and Kramatorsk, pre-war population 150,000. Before long, all of the Donetsk Oblast, that's region, would be within Russia's grasp, handing Moscow the entirety of a zone where its forces have been actively engaged since 2014. Captured Donetsk in its entirety, and with the right manpower and warfighting equipment, which in this case we're going to assume that Russia has, the way is clear for a devastating next step: breakaway. Once you move westward from Donetsk, the territory in eastern Ukraine gets very easy to attack and very hard to defend. Flat open land with few natural obstacles past the outer bounds of the so-called Ukrainian Wall, a set of 3 defensive lines that Ukraine spent years building in order to prevent a surge just like this. Pokrovsk was located on the third and final of the Ukrainian Wall's defensive lines, and although Ukraine has been hard at work preparing deeper defensive positions in case Pokrovsk fell, those defenses weren't nearly ready by April of this year. Break past the wall, and Russian armored columns of sufficient strength could attempt to travel down the E50 highway through Pavlohrad, pre-war population 100,000, then to Dnipro, Ukraine's 4th largest city, with a pre-war population of just a hair under 1 million. Now, for the purpose of today's discussion, we're going to assume that this offensive would work, but it's worth paying a good deal of respect to the fortifications all along the E50 highway, as well as some of the other critical roads that could lead Russian forces deeper into Ukraine. After years of war, highways like the E50 are dotted with dragon's teeth, concrete mounds that are meant to prevent tanks from easily navigating the roads, as well as purpose-built anti-tank ditches meant to catch heavy armor in deep pits. The landscape is ensnared in a web of barbed wire, booby-trapped with minefields and electronic warfare tools to prevent drones from being effective, while a series of trenches along the highway would allow Ukrainian forces to dig in and prevent easy territorial captures. But while many of those static defenses, the dragon's teeth, the pits, the minefields, would hold in the event of a Russian breakthrough, the defenses that rely on personnel would be another story. With its forces depleted, Ukraine's military would struggle to send troops to the area fast enough in any meaningful numbers to be able to stop such a large push. In the city of Dnipro, Russian forces would find elite Ukrainian units ready to oppose them, and they'd probably struggle to cross the vast Dnieper River given Ukraine's likely willingness to destroy the bridges that would allow easy access. But for our purposes today, whatever battle takes place in Dnipro will go down as a Russian victory, and from there, everything begins to collapse. A capture of Dnipro would thrust a knife deep into Ukrainian territory that was once considered safe, and with control over the highways leading into the Ukrainian heartland, Russia could concentrate its forces for rapid northward and southward advances. With sustained pressure across the war's current front lines, plus the threat of Russian columns showing up at Ukraine's rear, the threat of encirclement would quickly outweigh the value of holding the front line in many areas. To the south, a Russian advance that follows the Dnieper River could topple the cities of Zaporizhzhia, pre-war population 700,000, Nikopol, pre-war population 105,000, and finally Kherson near the southern coast, pre-war population 280,000. Moving northward, Russian forces could threaten the cities of Poltava, pre-war population 280,000, Sumy, pre-war 255,000, and worse yet, Kharkiv, Ukraine's 2nd largest city, pre-war 1.4 million. And as difficult as it may be to conceive of these defeats, in today's wartime environment, it's important to emphasize that once Russia breaks through to the heartland, it could attack in many directions at once, taking advantage of minimal defenses in backline areas, a scarcity of Ukrainian troops in areas far from the front, and a wealth of highways and roads to navigate between cities, all while Ukrainian leadership would likely be in disarray and attempting to organize a withdrawal in order to save as many lives as possible. With so much of the Dnieper's eastern shores under control, Russia could likely find parts of the river where it could cross troops and equipment over bridges that weren't destroyed in time, or at worst, commandeer barges and other crossing equipment to do it the hard way. Meanwhile, with control over cities like Sumy in the north, Russia could make a second attempt to attack Kyiv directly. That assault would almost certainly learn the lessons of Russia's 2022 failure. Namely, don't forget to refuel your bloody tanks. Relative to other parts of Ukraine, Kyiv would be well defended, but in the disarray and confusion of a Russian breakthrough at multiple points along the front, Ukraine may lack the means to rapidly pivot enough forces to defend the capital. The opposite could happen, of course, seeing that the east has been lost, Ukrainian forces could concentrate in Kyiv and other important cities and prepare for a siege. But again, we're entertaining a hypothetical, so perhaps because of disorganization or poorly managed retreat, perhaps because Belarus gets involved, perhaps because Russian forces simply attack from too many angles, our scenario results in a Ukrainian defeat in Kyiv. Perhaps part of the added pressure even comes from Hungary, where earlier this year Ukraine lobbed allegations that Hungarian spies have been preparing for a potential occupation of a part of western Ukraine known as Transcarpathia. Either way, amidst the chaos and confusion of a lightning assault in which Russian forces are able to pivot and rapidly force encirclement-style retreats in one zone after another, the prospect of holding Kyiv becomes untenable. The United States declines to take any meaningful action to intervene, Europe by itself has little hope of stemming the tide, and perhaps within just a few days of the start of Russia's new offensive, the white, blue and red of the Russian tricolor flies over the Verkhovna Rada. the Supreme Council of Ukraine. After that, it's conceivable that a few spots in Ukraine could hold out. The southern port city of Odessa near Moldova and NATO member Romania, and protected at sea by Ukraine's proven unmanned drone boats, could likely endure a siege for some time, especially if a Russian push on Kyiv gave troops in the south enough time to take up positions in and around the city, potentially numbering in the tens of thousands. The western city of Lviv is located near Poland, in a more defensible area with foothills and forests, and far enough away from Transcarpathia that Hungary's somewhat meager army would be unlikely to overextend itself. For that reason, Lviv could turn into a fallback point where Ukrainian troops could hold back a Russian advance for at least a little while, buying time for a massive wave of war refugees to escape, along with members of the Ukrainian military and the government who'd survived and chosen to flee. But neither Lviv nor Odessa nor any other Ukrainian city could hold out forever, especially after command and control infrastructure across the rest of the country had been lost, and after Russia can destroy Ukrainian air defenses to clear the way for the use of its own heavy bombers. In this dark version of Ukraine's future, the summer of 2025 sees the demise of the Ukrainian state itself, as the mission that Vladimir Putin began in 2022 is brought to a bloody conclusion. When we imagine an occupied Ukraine, we must account for the existence of two discrete groups of Ukrainians: those who flee, those who stay. We'll discuss those who are able to get out of the country and choose to do so first. Many of them will have chosen to leave the country before Russia's breakthrough proved to be a success, joining the nearly 7 million people who've already left their home nation as refugees. Those who read news reports or hear from their neighbors about what would have been an incredible buildup of Russian troops and equipment may see the writing on the wall and attempt to get out before panic sets in. Once a Russian breakthrough does occur and it becomes clear that Russia is about to start capturing mass amounts of territory, that panic would have set in, just as it's done in any number of territories worldwide that have been subject to foreign invasion and conquest. Those who leave early, even from areas far from the initial Russian thrust, have the best shot at getting away, while a series of progressive encirclements of territory by Russia will mean that those who waited until the last minute may find themselves cut off from exit sooner than they realized. Once the bulk of Russia's territorial capture has taken place and internally displaced people who've avoided the Russians can make their way to departure points, the process is likely to be as complicated as it is painful. Perhaps NATO nations could organize an exodus by sea from the southern coastline, ferrying citizens on ships from Odessa and elsewhere, taking them to Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, or even beyond. Tiny Moldova, and particularly the isolated breakaway province of Transnistria along the Ukrainian border, may find themselves overwhelmed, with a few 100,000 refugees probably being enough to topple what remains of the Transnistrian autonomous state. Poland, and to a lesser extent Slovakia, might see their own massive influx of Ukrainians who've passed through Lviv or the smaller city of Lutsk. Russian ally Belarus to the north is far less likely to process new arrivals. As for the overall number of Ukrainians who'd attempt to leave, a precise figure is difficult to pin down, not least because there's no telling which parts of the nation would come under Russian control before residents could get out. But before the start of the war in 2022, Ukraine was a nation of some 44 million people. Of their number, the 7 million who've chosen to leave would constitute a full 16% of the country's population, roughly 1 in every 6. And when we add roughly 3.8 million people who are already displaced within Ukraine, we come to about 22% of the population that have already had to leave their homes prior to the hypothetical Russian breakthrough that we've laid out. Of the 34 million who've been able to remain in their homes, there's no telling who would choose to stay or go. But we can use a helpful analog: the number of Ukrainians who choose to leave the Donbass region from the time that Russia began an irregular invasion in 2014 until today. In total, about 30% of Ukrainian residents of the Donbass chose to leave, a number that, if used on the 34 million Ukrainians yet to be displaced, would equate to a wave of roughly 10 million Ukrainian refugees streaming over the border. And that is in addition, by the way, to those 3.8 million who were already internally displaced. But by relying on Donbass figures, we're likely to underestimate the true total. After all, many residents of the Donbass before 2014 were Russian speakers with some affinity toward Moscow. Even by 2020, after 6 years of low-grade warfare, a poll found that if given the choice, only about half of Donbass residents would want to remain part of Ukraine. Compare that to a poll in late 2024 measuring Ukrainian perceptions of Russia in parts of the country still under Ukraine's control, where a full 84% of Ukrainians stated that they held negative views of Moscow. Assuming perfect conditions where each of those people choose to leave and were able to do so, and it would constitute the largest mass migration wave in history. 28.5 million people streaming westward into Europe. Many flee because after 3.5 years, after atrocities at Bucha and reports streaming out of occupied territory, they know full well what life under Moscow will be like. Others flee because they, as individuals, have taken actions during the war that could eventually be sniffed out by Russia and used against them with devastating effect. Financial support to Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines, or donations to weapon procurement initiatives. Social media posts condemning Russia's invasion or railing against Vladimir Putin himself. Membership in Ukraine's military-industrial complex, or a close blood relation to somebody serving, or somebody who's publicly and prominently spoken out against Russia, could also be an issue. If the experience of ordinary Russians is any indication, Ukrainians who break Putin's social contract, don't speak out against the regime, will be in danger. And those who've already broken the social contract that would be imposed upon them would have to concede that it's in their best interest to run. Then there are the most vulnerable Ukrainians of all under Russian occupation, troops who fought against Moscow, members of the political or intellectual class who worked to oppose the invasion, and Ukraine's political leaders, most of all Volodymyr Zelensky himself. Even before Russia invaded in 2022, Moscow had placed a target on the backs of Zelensky and his inner circle, with over 400 mercenaries of the Wagner Group charged with infiltrating Kyiv prior to the start of the invasion so that they could kill Zelensky and a number of other important government figures as the war began. According to Ukraine's government, there have been numerous attempts on Zelensky's life since then, as well as the lives of his inner circle, with the details of their travel across their home nation treated as a closely guarded secret. Those who are unable to escape the country in time or refuse to do so would thus have no reason to expect that they'd be allowed to live the rest of their lives unbothered. Instead, they'd likely be looking at sham trials, followed by inevitable convictions, long prison sentences in brutal penal colonies, and quite possibly torture in Russian custody, both before and after their sentencing. Those who are less lucky, or to whom Russia may not want to give the option to become publicly martyred, may be quietly dispatched behind the scenes. As for Ukrainian soldiers, the treatment of Ukrainian POWs in Russian custody has been straightforward enough. Ukrainians who've been put on trial in Russia have been designated enemies of the Russian state, and in the case of members of the Azov Battalion and other distinct organizations within the Ukrainian military, they've been branded as terrorists. The same show trials then follow, and some Ukrainian soldiers have been sentenced to spend multiple decades in penal colonies, where they're unlikely ever to be released, even if they survive. So, after we account for those who leave, we've got to talk about those who stay. The millions of Ukrainians who will either opt to remain in their homes and communities despite the occupation, or will otherwise find themselves with no way to leave. In the event of a full Russian conquest, those who remain will live in a nation that's been emptied of its people, where the combination of declining birth rates well before the war, hundreds of thousands of wartime casualties, and the exodus of some 10 million or more will leave behind a hollowed-out husk where Ukraine itself used to be. For that reason, we've got to account for the likely strain on society to stay afloat. Fewer people to fill out civil society. Almost certainly an element of brain drain as well-educated and well-off Ukrainians find a way out and bring their wealth and expertise with them. Fewer people to work Ukraine's endless farmlands. Fewer people to fill city streets. Fewer people to support the aging population that's too old to work and unable to escape in time. All that, and a fair portion of the country would likely be left in ruins, the east littered with unexploded ordnance, and the cities where Ukrainian forces chose to make a stand almost certainly devastated by Russia's preferred method of artillery warfare. Level everything, put a Russian flag on top of the rubble. The political status of an occupied Ukraine is an open question. If Russia's conduct in the Donbass, Crimea, and Ukraine's southeastern oblasts is any indication, then Russia may choose to annex Ukraine outright, making it just another part of the Russian Federation. Or, if the Kremlin feels some need to maintain a veneer of plausible deniability for an international audience, it might choose to install and support a puppet government in Kyiv, justifying the long-term deployment of troops as a mere stabilization mission, while handpicking the officials tasked with bending Ukraine to its will. In the Donbass, Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts were administered by the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, respectively, and perhaps Putin will decide that the Ukraine People's Republic just has a really nice ring to it. But behind any illusion of Ukrainian self-determination, expect the reality to be a simple one. Russia is in control, Russia will have its way. Luckily for us, although substantially less lucky for the people of Donbass, we have the benefit of over a decade of Russian occupation in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea to give an idea of how Russia would administer its new territory. On the ground, The results are grim. In occupied Ukraine today, Russia makes a point of controlling the ways that people communicate. Audio and video calls on foreign messaging apps have just recently been banned, while a Russian state-controlled messaging system known as MAX has been thoroughly imposed on Donbass residents. Peaceful protest is banned in its entirety. Political speech and activity is actively and often violently suppressed outside Russian state-approved political parties, while the broader idea of free speech in person, in writing, or in digital media is nothing more than a laughingstock. Bribery and official corruption are common. It's not unusual for state authorities to extort residents or communities, and many civil leaders reportedly have ties to organized criminal elements that exert their own substantial power there. Ethnic Ukrainians have it considerably worse than others, as they, as well as Crimean Tatars, have been targeted by massive state initiatives to eliminate the use of the Ukrainian language, force out the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and deport Ukrainian children to be sent to indoctrination centers intended to erase Ukrainian cultural identity. People who lack Russian passports, no matter who they are regarded as being functionally stateless, with possession of a Russian passport signifying voluntary participation in what Russia claims is its rightful political dominion over the territory. As for how people get Russian passports, well, they're coerced into doing so, barred from the healthcare and pension systems, and living at risk of imprisonment until they can produce one. Take the approach Russia has taken to the Donbass, extend it to the entire nation of Ukraine, and it's probably obvious that life for most people in the country would become very, very difficult very quickly. At a minimum, all manner of basic freedoms that Ukrainians are accustomed to would go away. The ability to more or less say and do as they please, the ability to communicate with loved ones abroad, even the ability to acknowledge that they might think of themselves as Ukrainians. Russian troops stationed all over the country to keep order and impose the will of the Kremlin would likely have few incentives to treat Ukrainians with even the most basic decency. After all, occupying the rest of Ukraine wouldn't be like occupying the Donbass, where a fair share of the residents were at least relatively amenable to the idea that they could live under Russian rule. In the rest of the Ukraine, where again over 80% of people see Russia in a negative light, Russian forces may be empowered to engage in regular, widespread violence to see that Putin's mandates are imposed. Just take the horrific torture that happened in occupied Bucha in the early days of the 2022 invasion to get an idea of what that might mean. For Russia, the idea of denazification of Ukraine has been a defining element of the ongoing invasion based on entirely false claims that Ukraine has been built into a neo-Nazi state. By the way, when we say that's outright false, we can do better than just pointing out that Ukraine is led by a Jewish president whose family members died in the Holocaust. Instead, we'll emphasize the much more important point that the claims of institutional neo-Nazism in Ukraine are backed by practically zero credible evidence of any kind. For Russia, of course, that doesn't matter. In the Donbass, denazification has been used as a pretext to abduct and indoctrinate children, to criminalize speech and symbology related to the Ukrainian state, and to gut civil administration and eliminate people who bear any loyalty to a Ukrainian government. Extended to the rest of the country, and it's hard to see a repressive action where Russia couldn't claim denazification as pretext, considering that it has no real obligation to produce any evidence to support that claim. Whether by merging Russian indoctrination programs with the Ukrainian school system, purging communities of people believed to harbor loyalist sympathies toward Ukraine, engaging in retributive violence against the Ukrainian people, or probably all three, denazification and other Russian purity initiatives are likely to become a fixture of everyday life. Of course, just because Russia would have conquered Ukraine's territory doesn't mean the fight is over. Ukraine has been fighting Russia at scale for the better part of 4 years now. It's been fighting in Donbass for over a decade, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian troops share precisely zero intention of lying down to welcome occupation. Many will leave, and many more will sacrifice their lives trying to buy precious time for others to escape. But others will stay, hide away their weapons and ammunition, wait for the early horrors of Russian occupation to play out, and eventually get back to work. Irregular rebel forces or partisans have been at work for years in occupied Ukraine, sometimes carrying out attacks of their own, but most of the time taking advantage of their partnership with a free, militarily well-equipped Kyiv to deal maximum damage. To do that, they provide as much intelligence as possible, the locations and layouts of military and industrial targets, the movements of important Russian officers and their Ukrainian collaborators, the shifting positions of military equipment, and more. But in a Ukraine that's been taken over by Russia, the mission would shift dramatically to match asymmetric, insurgent warfare relying on secretive, mobile units and small arms in the same way that countless resistance groups have done across history. Although it's unknown whether Ukraine and its allies have updated or expanded their contingency plans for partisan resistance after Russia invaded in 2022, we do know that there was some talk of that option before the full-scale invasion commenced. Remember, before the Russian offensive stalled on the capital's outskirts, the expectation, even within Ukraine, was that much, if not all, of the nation would be captured in short order. Prior to the invasion, as Russia built up its troops, thousands of Ukrainian civilians were trained in guerrilla warfare tactics on the assumption that under Russian occupation, they'd go underground and continue the fight. The goal wasn't to stop Russia from occupying Ukraine's territory, but instead to make it abundantly clear to Russia that there's a big difference between merely sitting on territory and securing it. Today, any updated version of a Ukrainian partisan resistance will benefit from the experience of battle-hardened combat veterans well-versed in the use of all manner of weaponry with a well-developed aptitude in targeting Russian invaders. Any war veterans who choose to join a partisan resistance will likely be able to do so. And although it's implausible that a partisan resistance could grow so strong that it could take back and then hold Ukrainian cities, it could certainly take root in western foothills, in southern coastal regions, and along porous borders with Moldova, where they won't be so easy to hunt down as they would be in rural parts of the east. Others will take to the cities, while still others will likely be able to position and hide away captured or smuggled reserves of supplies and ammunition. They'd also be better equipped to fight an asymmetric insurgency than nearly any force in history, not just because of their ubiquitous access to NATO standard weaponry, but because of the technology at their fingertips. Ukraine's ability to use consumer-grade drones as a weapon of war is unparalleled in today's world, and some of the nation's drone makers could even move underground and continue their work at a smaller scale. In the digital realm, a combination of sophisticated encryption tools, internet access technology like Starlink and its competitors, and cryptocurrency-fueled global exchange markets can enable cash flows unlike what has ever been seen before. And speaking of cash, the Ukrainian post-war resistance might be on the back foot, but it won't be alone. Similar to other global diasporas that send funds to enable resistance movements back home, the Ukrainian diaspora will quite likely be willing and enthusiastic donors who are unlikely to find that donor activity penalized in Western nations, especially the nations of NATO. In fact, NATO could very plausibly get in on the game, or at the very least, individual nations could. Poland in particular might find it worthwhile to find ways to smuggle weapons and supplies into occupied territory while enabling the transfer of funds that would ensure that Russia's problems in Ukraine are so great that its push toward the West would be a fool's errand. The same could be said for the Baltic nations, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, that know they'll be overwhelmed if Russia were to attack, and that decide, for that reason, that it's worth risking Moscow's ire in order to ensure that Ukraine isn't pacified. Right now, the support sent by the Baltics to Ukraine is very significant from their own budgetary perspective, but minuscule on the international stage. Latvia, for example, has sent about €500 million to Ukraine's military thus far. But although €500 million is a tiny sum when being fed into the Ukrainian war machine that requires hundreds of times that much to stay afloat, that same $500 million could go a very long way when supporting irregular partisan units in Ukrainian countryside. In fact, with such a massive portion of Ukrainians forced to flee Ukraine, with Ukrainian civil and military leaders evacuating beside them, an occupied Ukraine's place in the future might be less similar to, say, a Poland controlled by the USSR than to the Free France of World War II. After France fell to the Nazis in 1940, the Free French under Charles de Gaulle maintained a government in exile in London for years, sending substantial support to the French resistance and working to support Allied military operations abroad. In a Europe where Ukraine has been taken over in its entirety, and where the next step will almost certainly be a Russian challenge to the unity of NATO, there's a home for tens or even hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian veterans all up and down what would become Europe's ultimate front line. The role of Ukrainian leaders, experts, writers, and public figures may well be vital in the tense years that follow, helping Western nations to reconstitute their militaries, raising awareness and resolve against the Russian threat, and explaining firsthand the horrors that come with Russian invasion. Right now, in the somewhat better version of history for Ukraine that we all live within, Ukraine isn't just a nation under attack, it's a bulwark, holding firm to protect the rest of the European continent. If Russia were to complete a full invasion and occupation of Ukraine, devastating results would follow. The forcible displacement of millions, all manner of death and destruction in the process, a new migration crisis for the Western world, and untold atrocities perpetrated on the Ukrainians who either choose or were forced to stay. But Ukraine's geopolitical role as a stonewall against Russian aggression wouldn't change, or certainly not if Ukrainians have anything to say about it. An occupied Ukraine may fulfill the grand ambitions of Vladimir Putin and his inner circle, but until Ukraine can either be pacified by force or return to the control of its people, the nation will most likely play host to a very long war. Thank you for watching.